It's 3 a.m. and your mind will not stop talking. The conversation you should have had. The email you shouldn't have sent. The decision that might ruin everything. Around and around it goes. The same 5 thoughts. Dressed in new clothes every single night. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are simply fighting a war that men fought 2,000 years ago and lost, until they discovered the one weapon that ends it. Today, you're going to learn how to use it. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the place where 2,000-year-old philosophy meets your very modern problems. If you're new here, we take the teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca, and we turn them into tools you can actually use tonight, tomorrow morning, and for the rest of your life. If that sounds like something you need, hit subscribe now, because what you're about to hear may be the most important 20 minutes you spend all week. Let me ask you something honestly. How many hours this week have you spent replaying a conversation that already ended? How many nights has sleep arrived late because your mind insisted on rehearsing disasters that haven't happened, revisiting mistakes that can't be undone, or auditioning outcomes for situations you don't even control? If you're being honest with yourself, and I hope you are, because that's where all real change begins, the number is higher than you'd like to admit. Here's the strange part. You already know overthinking doesn't help. You know that replaying the argument for the 100th time won't change a single word that was said. You know that imagining every possible way tomorrow's meeting could go wrong won't actually prepare you for it. It will only exhaust you before it starts. And yet you keep doing it. Why? Because somewhere along the way, you were taught, by school, by culture, by well-meaning but mistaken people, that thinking harder is always thinking better. That if you just turn the problem over one more time, examine it from one more angle, you'll finally find the exit. But overthinking isn't thinking. It's a loop with no door. And the ancient Stoics understood this with a clarity that modern psychology is only now catching up to. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, ruler of an empire that stretched across 3 continents, wrote in the privacy of his own journal, never meant for anyone else's eyes, about this exact struggle. Epictetus, born into slavery, with nothing in the world he could call his own except his mind, built an entire philosophy around this single problem. And Seneca, advisor to an emperor, a man who lived every day under the shadow of potential execution, developed some of the most practical techniques for mental peace ever written, precisely because his circumstances gave him no other choice. These weren't men writing comfortable theories from armchairs. These were men whose survival, literal, physical survival, depended on mastering their own minds. And what they discovered is what we're going to walk through today. Not abstract philosophy, but a working system. A way to recognize the loop, interrupt the loop, and finally, protect the one thing that no one can ever take from you unless you hand it over willingly, your peace. Stay with me through this one, because by the end, you won't just understand why you overthink. You'll know exactly what to do the next time it starts. The prison you built yourself. Let me tell you about Elena. Elena was sharp, genuinely sharp. The kind of person who solved problems for a living, who colleagues came to when something needed fixing. But there was one problem Elena could never fix. Herself. At 11 o'clock at night, staring at a text message she'd sent 4 hours earlier that still hadn't been answered. Did I say something wrong? Did I come across as needy? Should I have waited a day before texting back? What if she's annoyed with me? What if this is the beginning of the end of the friendship? 4 hours, one unanswered text. And Eleanor's mind had already written, rehearsed, and performed an entire tragedy, complete with betrayal, distance, and a slow fade into silence, all of it happening nowhere except behind her own eyes. The next morning, her friend replied with a laughing emoji and an apology for falling asleep early. That was it. That was the entire crisis. Elena had spent an evening of her one, irreplaceable life in a prison, and she had built every wall of it herself. Does this sound familiar to you? Be honest in the comments below. How many hours this month have you handed over to a crisis that turned out to be nothing at all? Here's what Marcus Aurelius understood, writing to himself in his tent on the frontier of the empire, surrounded by war, plague, and betrayal far more real than anything. Eleanor or you or I typically face, "Today I escaped from anxiety." Or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. Read that again. He didn't say the anxiety left him. He said he discarded it because it was his to discard. It lived inside his own perception of events, not in the events themselves. The frontier was real. The war was real. But the anxiety, the looping, spiraling, sleep-stealing anxiety, that was manufactured entirely in his own mind. And if it was manufactured there, it could be dismantled there too. This is the first truth we need to sit with today, and it might be uncomfortable. Overthinking is not caused by your circumstances. It's caused by your relationship to your circumstances. Elena's friend not texting back for 4 hours was the circumstance. The tragedy, the betrayal, the fade into silence. All of that was Elena's mind, working overtime, manufacturing suffering out of raw material that didn't actually contain any. The Stoics called this the difference between the event and your judgment of the event. Two people can experience the exact same 4-hour silence. One goes to bed peacefully, trusting their friend is simply asleep. The other stage is a full theatrical production of abandonment. Same event, wildly different suffering. And the only variable, the only one, is the mind interpreting it. I want you to think of your mind for a moment as a courtroom. Every day evidence comes in, an unanswered message, a curt reply from your boss, a look from a stranger, a stray thought about the future. And your mind, acting as prosecutor, judge, and jury all at once, takes that evidence and builds a case, usually the worst possible case. It convicts you before the trial has even properly begun. The Stoics don't ask you to stop noticing the evidence. That's not possible, and it's not even desirable. Awareness is valuable. What they ask is far more radical. Stop assuming your first interpretation is the correct one. Stop letting the prosecutor run the courtroom unchallenged. The dichotomy that changes everything. Now let me tell you about James. James ran a mid-sized company through what should have been its best year, and instead, it became the year that nearly broke him. A competitor undercut his prices. A key client left without warning. The market shifted in ways no one could have predicted, and James did what so many of us do when the world stops cooperating. He tried to control everything. He rewrote the same strategy document 11 times. He called board members at midnight to relitigate decisions already made. He lay awake running financial models in his head, as if enough mental repetition could somehow reach through time and change a client's mind. His wife told him later that for nearly 6 months, he was physically present at dinner and completely absent from it. His eyes were at the table, but his mind was somewhere in an imagined future, fighting battles that hadn't happened yet and might never happen at all. James wasn't lazy. He wasn't unintelligent. He was making the single most common mistake in human psychology, and one that Epictetus identified with surgical precision nearly 2,000 years before James was born. Epictetus opens his most famous work, the Enchiridion, with a sentence so simple it's almost easy to dismiss, and so powerful that if you actually lived by it, your entire relationship with anxiety would transform within a month. He wrote, "Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us." That's it. That's the whole foundation. But let's slow down and actually feel the weight of it, because most people nod along with this idea without ever applying it. What was actually up to James? His preparation, his effort, his honesty with his team, his own decisions made with the best information available at the time. That's it. That's the entire list. What was not up to James? The competitor's pricing strategy, the client's decision to leave, the market's shift, the board's opinions, ultimately. In other words, almost everything he was losing. Sleepover lived entirely outside the boundary of his control. He was spending his one finite store of energy each day defending territory he never owned in the first place. Epictetus had a particular authority to say this, because he lived it in the most extreme way imaginable. He was born a slave. His own body was, quite literally, not up to him. His leg was broken by a master, and historical accounts suggest he endured this abuse without complaint, understanding even then that his tormentor could control his limb but never his mind. Think about that contrast for a moment. A man who owned nothing, not his body, not his freedom, not his own daily schedule, became one of history's great teachers of peace, while so many of us who own our homes, our time, our choices, remain prisoners of anxieties about things we were never going to control anyway. If Epictetus could draw this line while enslaved, we can certainly draw it while sitting at a kitchen table, anxious about a text message, or pacing an office at midnight, anxious about a client's decision. Here is the practical tool, and I want you to actually use this the next time your mind starts spiraling. Not just admire it as a nice idea. Ask yourself 2 questions in this exact order. Question 1. Is this actually up to me? If the honest answer is no, the outcome of a job interview after you've submitted your best application, a friend's opinion of you after you've been honest and kind, a diagnosis after you've done everything medically responsible, then continued. Thinking about it isn't preparation. It's just suffering wearing the costume of preparation. Let it go, not because it doesn't matter, but because your worry adds nothing to it except your own exhaustion. Question 2. If it is up to me, have I already done what's within my power today? If yes, you've sent the email, made the call, had the honest conversation, then further rumination isn't productive planning. It's the mind mistaking motion for progress. You've done the up-to-you part. The rest belongs to the world now, and the world does not require your anxiety as a co-signer. James, when he finally learned this, and it took him months, not minutes, so be patient with yourself too, described it as being handed back an enormous amount of time and energy he didn't even realize he'd lost. He hadn't been working 18-hour days because the business demanded it. He'd been working 18-hour days because his anxiety demanded it, and he'd mistaken the anxiety's voice for the business's voice. They are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. I want you to pause the video right here for one moment, genuinely, and ask yourself, what is one thing you've been mentally wrestling with today that, if you're honest, was never up to you at all? Type it in the comments if you're comfortable. Sometimes naming it out loud is the first crack in the wall. The weight of what already happened. There's a third kind of overthinking we haven't discussed yet, and it might be the heaviest of all. It's not about an uncertain future or an unanswered message. It's about the past. The moment you keep returning to, the decision you keep relitigating, the version of yourself you can't forgive. Marco was 71 years old, and for over a decade, he'd been replaying a single conversation with his son. A conversation from a time when Marco was working too much, too stressed, too short-tempered, and said something in anger that he never should have said. His son had long since forgiven him. They had rebuilt their relationship. They spoke every week now, and it was warm and it was real. But Marco hadn't forgiven himself. Every quiet evening that old conversation would resurface, and Marco would sit with the letter his son had once written him, an old letter, full of love, written years after the argument, and instead of feeling comforted by it, he'd feel the original guilt all over again. This is a different flavor of overthinking than Elena's anxious spiraling or James's controlling grip on the future. This is rumination. And Seneca, of all the Stoics, wrote about this with the most tenderness, because Seneca understood grief and regret intimately. He lost his own son. He lived through exile, through the collapse of his reputation, through years waiting for an emperor's paranoid mood to decide whether he would live or die. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius, "He who suffers before it is necessary, suffers more than is necessary." And in a separate letter, discussing regret over the past, he made a point that I think is the emotional key to this entire section. The past cannot be changed by your suffering over it, but your relationship to the past absolutely can be changed by how you choose to hold it now. Marco was not being punished by his past mistake. His son had made that clear 100 times over. Marco was punishing himself, using a memory as the whip, and mistaking the pain of that self-punishment for some kind of moral debt still owed. But here's the question worth sitting with. What debt, exactly, was still owed? He had apologized. He had changed his behavior. He had rebuilt the relationship through years of consistent, patient love. The debt, if it ever truly existed in that form, had been paid many times over. This is where the Stoic concept of amor fati becomes not just a nice phrase for a tattoo, but an actual survival tool. Amor fati means love of fate, not resignation, not pretending bad things are secretly good, but a full acceptance of what has already happened as unchangeable, combined with a determination to make meaning from it rather than be destroyed by it. Marco's mistake all those years ago was real. It caused real pain. Nothing about Stoicism asks you to pretend otherwise. But that mistake had also, over the following decade, taught Marco how to be patient, how to listen before speaking, how to be the kind of grandfather to his own grandchildren that he hadn't managed to be as a younger father. The mistake was not erased, but it had been metabolized into wisdom. And once Marco understood that the version of himself doing the punishing in the present moment was not protecting his son from harm, his son was thriving, loved, and had already forgiven him. The ongoing suffering revealed itself for what it actually was, a habit with no purpose left to serve. If you're carrying something like this right now, a decision, a conversation, a version of yourself from years ago that you cannot seem to release, I want you to consider this question honestly. Is the continued suffering protecting anyone or serving anyone in the present moment? Or has it simply become a groove worn so deep into your mind that you keep falling into it, out of habit rather than necessity? This isn't about forgetting. The Stoics never asked anyone to forget. It's about reclassifying. The event moves from an open wound requiring constant attention to a closed chapter that shaped who I became. That single shift in classification is often the difference between a person who is haunted and a person who is simply wise. If this section is resonating with you, if there's a Marco moment somewhere in your own memory, take a breath right now. You're not alone in this, and more importantly, you are allowed to set it down. The inner citadel, building your defense. So far, we've diagnosed the problem. Elena showed us how the mind manufactures crisis from silence. James showed us how much energy we waste defending territory we never controlled. Marco showed us how the past can hold us hostage long after it's stopped being dangerous. Now let's build something. Let's talk about defense, because understanding a problem, intellectually and actually protecting yourself from it day to day are two very different skills. Marcus Aurelius used a phrase that has echoed for 2,000 years, and it's become almost a signature of Stoic philosophy, the inner citadel. He wrote that no matter what chaos surrounds a person, war outside the tent, betrayal within the court, plague moving through the empire, there exists a fortress within the mind that cannot be breached by anyone except its own owner. The mind is the ruler of the soul, he wrote, and should not be disturbed by movements in the flesh. But let it be circumscribed and keep those motions in their proper limits. Here's what I love about this image, and I want you to actually picture it as we go through these 4 techniques, because visualization makes the tool stick far better than abstraction does. Imagine your mind as a fortress on a hill. Outside the walls, the world happens. Messages go unanswered. Markets shift. People misunderstand you. Mistakes get made. That's the terrain outside the citadel, and it is chaotic, unpredictable, and entirely outside your jurisdiction. But inside the walls, that's your judgment, your interpretation, your chosen response. And that is the one piece of territory that no emperor, no enemy, no unanswered text message, and no decade-old mistake can ever occupy, unless you personally open the gates and let it in. Overthinking, from this angle, is simply the act of opening your own gates and inviting The siege inside voluntarily. So let's talk about 4 practical ways to keep those gates closed. Real techniques. Not vague inspiration. Technique 1. The morning premeditation. Seneca practiced something called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Each morning he would briefly consider what might go wrong that day. A delay, a disagreement, an unexpected setback. This sounds at first like it might fuel anxiety rather than cure it, but it does the opposite. And here's why. When you deliberately, calmly consider a setback in a controlled 5-minute exercise each morning, your mind has already rehearsed the emotional response. When the setback actually happens later that day, it doesn't hijack you, because part of you has already been there. It's the difference between an ambush and an expected guest. Try this tomorrow morning. Before you check your phone, spend 3 quiet minutes considering one thing that might not go your way today, and simply ask yourself calmly, if this happens, will I still be able to act with patience and integrity? The answer is almost always yes, and that answer, rehearsed in advance, becomes armor later. Technique 2. The evening review. Both Seneca and Epictetus recommended a nightly practice of reviewing the day, not to punish yourself, the way Marco did for a decade, but to simply observe, without judgment, what went well and where you slipped. Seneca wrote that he asked himself each night, what bad habit have you cured today? What fault have you checked? In what respect are you better? The key here is tone. This is not a courtroom. This is a mirror. You are not the prosecutor tonight. You are a calm observer, gathering information for tomorrow. 2 or 3 minutes before sleep, ask yourself honestly what happened today, what you're proud of, and what you'd like to do differently. And then, critically close the file. Don't reopen it at 2 a.m. You've already reviewed it. There's nothing more the review can give you at 2 a.m. that it couldn't give you at 9 p.m. Technique 3. The 10-minute rule. This one is practical and immediate. When you feel a spiral beginning, the Eleanor spiral, the 4-hour unanswered text spiral, give yourself permission to think about it. Fully and completely, for exactly 10 minutes. Set a timer if you need to. Let the worry run its course, uninterrupted. But when the timer ends, you close the gate. You've paid the thought its due attention. Anything beyond that 10 minutes is not additional insight. It's just the mind pacing the same hallway it already walked. This works because it doesn't ask you to suppress the thought, which rarely works and often backfires. It asks you to contain it. A river given a bank still flows freely. It simply doesn't flood the whole town. Technique 4. The view from above. Marcus Aurelius often practiced imagining himself from a great height, looking down at the empire, at armies, at the vast sweep of human history, watching his own worries shrink to the size they actually are within that scale. He called it viewing things from above. Next time a thought is looping, the email, the mistake, the argument, try this. Imagine yourself 100 years from now. Or imagine your life as a single dot on a timeline stretching from ancient Rome to a future you'll never see. Ask yourself honestly, will this moment still hold the same weight from that height? Almost never. And that shift in altitude, even held for 30 seconds, often loosens a grip that hours of direct struggle could not. These 4 techniques are not complicated. That's actually the point. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of complexity for its own sake. They believed the best philosophy could be carried in your pocket and used in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, not just admired in a book on a shelf. If you've made it this far, I'd genuinely love to know which of these 4 resonates with you the most right now. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone, and it helps me know what to cover more deeply in future videos. What peace actually costs. I want to be honest with you about something before we close, because I think most self-help content lies to you about this, and I don't want to. Protecting your peace is not free. It costs something. And the thing it costs is the illusion that if you just think hard enough, worry enough, control enough, you can guarantee outcomes. Letting go of overthinking means letting go of that illusion, and for a lot of people, that illusion has felt for years. like the only thing standing between them and disaster. Giving it up feels less like relief and more like risk. Elena had to accept that she could not guarantee her friendships would never face silence or misunderstanding. James had to accept that no amount of midnight strategizing could guarantee his company's success, that some things genuinely were and remain in the hands of a market he does not control. Marco had to accept that no further amount of guilt would make him a better father to a son who had already freely and completely forgiven him. This is the trade the Stoics are actually offering you, and I think it's important to say it plainly rather than let it sound like an easy fix. You trade the illusion of control over outcomes for the reality of control over your own judgment. That's the whole deal. It sounds like a smaller trade than it is. It is, in fact, the only trade that has ever actually worked for anyone in the entire history of human anxiety. Epictetus put it this way: man is disturbed not by things, but by the views he takes of them. Once you actually believe that sentence, not just understand it intellectually, but believe it in your bones, overthinking loses its grip. Because overthinking depends entirely on the assumption that if you spin the thought one more time, you'll finally arrive at safety. But safety was never in the spinning. It was always only available in the choosing to stop. I won't pretend this happens overnight. Elena still occasionally catches herself starting to spiral over a silence. The difference now is that she notices it within minutes instead of hours, and she has a tool, the 10-minute rule, to contain it rather than let it run wild. James still cares deeply about his business, as he should. The difference now is he asks the dichotomy question before he loses a night of sleep over it. Marco still remembers the old conversation with his son. The difference now is that the memory arrives without the punishment attached. It's simply part of his story now, not an open wound. That's what mastery of this actually looks like. Not the absence of the thought, the presence of a response. The practice starting tonight. Let's bring this all the way home, because information without application is just entertainment, and I don't want that for you tonight. Here is what I want you to actually do, starting with the very next time your mind begins to spiral.
First, notice it. That's the entire first step, and it's more powerful than it sounds. Most overthinking runs on autopilot. Precisely because it goes unnoticed, you don't realize you've been spiraling for 40 minutes until you're exhausted. At the other end of it, the moment you can say to yourself, even quietly, I am overthinking right now, you have already partially escaped it. Awareness and autopilot cannot coexist in the same moment. Second, ask the dichotomy question. Is this up to me? If not, you have full permission, Epictetus-level permission, to set it down. Not because it's unimportant, but because your attention was never going to change it, and your peace matters too. Third, if it is up to you, ask whether you've already done what's within your power today. If yes, the thinking is finished. What remains is trust. Trust in the effort you've already made, and trust that repeated worry is not additional effort, no matter how much it disguises itself as one. Fourth, if the spiral is about the past rather than the future, ask Marco's question, is this suffering protecting anyone right now, or has it simply become a habit? If it's a habit, you are allowed, genuinely, fully allowed, to reclassify it, not forget it. Reclassify it, from open wound to closed chapter. And finally, remember the fortress. Every single day, multiple times a day, you will be given the choice to either defend your inner citadel or throw the gates open to whatever chaos is knocking. Marcus Aurelius made that choice from inside a war tent. Epictetus made it from inside a body he did not legally own. Seneca made it while waiting, literally, to find out if he would be permitted to live. If they could close the gates under those conditions, you can close them over an unanswered message, an uncertain outcome, or an old regret. Your peace is not weakness. It is not avoidance. It is not denial of reality. It is, in the words carved into the practice of every Stoic who ever lived, the one form of power that can never be confiscated because it was never granted by anyone outside of you in the first place. It was always yours. You simply forgot you were allowed to use it.
Elena still gets anxious sometimes. James still faces real business problems. Marco still remembers what happened all those years ago. Nothing about their circumstances became perfect. What changed was the relationship between them and their own minds. And that relationship, once rebuilt, held steady even when the world around them didn't. That's available to you too. Not someday. Not once your circumstances finally settle down. Because they won't. Not completely, not ever, for anyone. It's available starting tonight, the next time your mind begins that familiar loop. Notice it, question it, contain it, and then gently close the gate. If this video gave you something real, a tool you're actually going to use, a story that felt a little too familiar, do me a favor and hit like before you go. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need exactly this tonight, at exactly this hour, staring at exactly this ceiling. And if you want more of this, practical Stoic wisdom for the actual, messy, 3 a.m. problems of modern life, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we release new episodes designed to help you build that inner citadel, one video at a time. Tell me in the comments, which of the 3 stories tonight, Eleanor's, James's or Marco's, felt most like your own? I read every comment, and honestly, some of the best insights on this channel come directly from this community. Until next time, protect your peace. No one can take it from you. Only you can hand it over.